So I want to start off this panel by showing us a short video. It's a piece of a much larger video that was done just recently. The full video is available, and we'll make it available for you, those of you who want to see it. But let's start the video now and give you a taste of what we're going to be talking about for the next panel. Chris, you want to share your screen?
In New York State here, we just had one of the largest criminal justice reform sets of initiatives ever put in place by any legislature in America or by any city council, and it's a mess. And why is it a mess? Because they didn't involve the judges, they didn't involve the DAs, they didn't involve the police, they didn't involve the mental health experts. We had 200 dummies sitting in the legislature up in Albany at midnight, basically came up with what passed for criminal justice reform, and they made a mess out of it.
You have to restore the health of a community before you can ever be successful as a police officer.
We haven't changed the basic mission of policing. The mission of policing is the thin blue line. That is the DNA of American policing. The leaders on this call have pioneered alternatives to that, but that is still the backbone, the DNA, and the marrow. And thin blue line policing sets police up to fail in the mission for legitimacy and trust with poor people.
What we need to do is get the city government, which means the city council, to work with the court system and the police department, and they all have to listen to each other. Not lecture to each other, but listen to each other about how they want to solve these problems.
It seems antithetical to community policing when you're trying to build relationships and you're stopping people who really haven't done anything wrong. And nobody likes to be stopped by the cops, and then they're angry. That's their experience. Maybe they're not experiencing what's going on with community policing, but they're experiencing this and they're saying, God damn it, I'm being stopped again. I didn't do anything wrong.
In the community safety partnership, that was the direction to the officers. I said, I'm not interested in law enforcement, really. I'm not interested in arrests. I'm not interested in citations. I'm not interested in any of that. I'm interested in what can you do as a police officer in your role to make this community healthy.
Thank you. I want to introduce through the video a stellar panel this morning with Bill Bratton, whose name you all will know. He's one of the world's most respected and trusted experts on risk and security issues, and he's the only person who's led police agencies of America's two largest cities, Los Angeles and New York City. And Connie Rice, who's equally well known both in Los Angeles and nationally, is the founder of the Advancement Project. She's a lawyer, author, and public intellectual who's renowned for fighting systemic injustice, racism, and advancing a multiracial democracy. And to lead the conversation, I'm really proud to introduce Joe Domanick, who's our Associate Director at the Center on Media, Crime, and Justice, the West Coast Bureau of the Crime Report, a renowned author. His most recent book is Blue, the LAPD, and the Battle to Redeem American Policing. He's going to take us through about an hour and 20 minutes of conversations with questions, I hope, from all of you to really set the tone of today's conversations on the future of American policing. Joe, the mic is yours. Welcome to all of you.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Let me just, you were kind enough to mention my book, and I also want to mention Connie Rice's book, which is really a how-to of how to start to reform the police department, and it's called Power Concedes Nothing. And Bill Bratton has a memoir coming out called The Professional, which I think is required reading for anybody interested in the subject of police reform. I'd like to start by asking Connie to say a few words about the webinar that we made with Chief BECK, Commissioner Bratton, you and me.
Thanks, Joe. Well, despite the buffering problems, if you heard what the speakers were saying, this was a conversation amongst unlikely allies who helped Bill Bratton carry out the consent decree. Joe, you're the historian of LAPD history, But I think the five of us got together because we were dismayed about the level of conversation in the wake of the George Floyd murder. We were dismayed about the lack of understanding of what it takes to take traditional law enforcement, make it constitutional, proportional, and legitimate, and trusted in poor neighborhoods. That's one set of conversations. But then there's another set of conversations which is about transformation. And I think that Bill and you and I are going to get into those two buckets. But this was if you want to see the full video, it's former Chief Beck, Bill Bratton, Chief of LAPD, Joe, myself, and Jerry CHALEFF, who was one of the catalysts for getting Bill Bratton into the LAPD. So it's a great conversation amongst people who have actually done on the ground, comprehensive, complicated change in a major police department. And I think that under Chief Bratton, we set the floor. And then when Chief Charlie Beck followed him, we took it to a level that I don't think any other police department has done.
Well, thank you, Connie. Before I go over to Bill and ask him to start his presentation, I'd like you to say a few words about something that we've discussed very frequently, and that is you can't have real police cultural reform until you change the lives of the people in the poor Black and brown communities that they're policing. Can you say a few words about that, please?
Or do you want me to comment, or is that for Connie? I'm sorry.
No, why don't we start with you, Bill, and then we'll go to Connie.
Well, the reality, the truth is that unless we change the lives of those people in their communities dramatically, not just from a law enforcement perspective, but from so many other ways, that we're really trying to swim against the tide. And good news is that for a period of time, we have a government that appears to be focused on trying to do that. Whereas for a period of time, we had a government that seemed to be really going in an opposite direction. But as essential as police are to trying to improve lives in America, that we cannot do it alone. That and as Connie has pointed out, and yourself in your writing, that the model that we had chose to use for most of our history was clearly not working. It was just alienating and adding to the burdens of those communities. Versus my own sense is that we're never going to see racial equality. We're never going to see true justice without the police. And we definitely need a policing philosophy that's very different than the one that controlled most of our history. Good news is that philosophy is out there. It is being implemented in certain places, being experimented with. And I've always made the point that if we're going to have true racial justice, true racial healing in this country, police are going to be an essential component of it. It can't be done without us.
Connie, go ahead, please.
I agree with Bill that, and in the video, almost all five of us were talking about a whole of government response. Right now, police are used to contain and control the communities that pose the most danger to the communities that are safe. And that's not a police decision. That's a larger society decision that has said there are certain communities that aren't going to make it to the table. And in those communities that are on the wrong side of the thin blue line, what we have are meta strategies of mass incarceration, wars on gangs, wars on drugs. And those larger strategies, along with the indeterminate sentencing and a lot of other public policy decisions that legislators have, we created an infrastructure of inequality and suppression that poor Black and poor Latino, and I would say even in the methamphetamine economies in poor rural white America, these are the communities we don't intend to include in our democratic prosperity. Once you've made that decision to exclude those communities, the police function, according to what the larger society has said, is make sure that the despair, the violence, the trauma, and all of the conditions that they suffer in, because we're not going to fix these communities, make sure it stays there. Make sure it doesn't reach Connie Rice's neighborhood or Nancy Reagan's neighborhood. That's containment suppression. That's the thin blue line paradigm. And I think that what this video, what our conversation was saying was that as long as that's what traditional enforcement is used for. Now, you can make traditional enforcement constitutional, proportionate, you can make it fair, you can fix traditional enforcement to avoid the kinds of extreme injustices that we saw in the George Floyd murder. I don't think anybody is arguing about this. Get rid of the gratuitous, savage brutality that we've seen on some of these videos of shootings of unarmed and unthreatening African Americans. There's rage about that. It is absolutely justified. There's no debate about that. There's also no debate about the fact that police have to take out violent predators. You cannot have gangs running these neighborhoods. My clients in these poorest of neighborhoods don't ask me to get rid of police. They want police who see their humanity. They want police who don't think of them as just fodder to get into SWAT. They want police who see that they're struggling in despair, and that they want them as partners to help them attain safety. That's what my clients tell me. Because if you take the police out, the gangs take over, and that's not what they want either. And in some areas, in some eras in LA, you couldn't tell the difference between the gang brutality or the police brutality in the community. So I think that the discussion that we were having, these old allies, we're old war horses at this. What we were talking about was that the solution lies, and you heard it in Charlie and Bill's comments, an unhealthy community sets both the police and the community up to fail. And what the community wants, I think overall, and I'm not dismissing the range in the protesters who are arguing for more radical, but radical inside of policing is not radical for the community. And what I've said is that there's been tremendous change at the top, the executive level of American policing, but the DNA has not been changed. We have not positioned police to succeed in a different mission. What Charlie Beck said was, I'm not interested in arrests. I want to know, can my police increase trust? Can they help empower this community to make itself healthier, reduce trauma, reduce violence? An arrest is considered a failure under the policing model that he built on from what Bill Bratton gave us. Chief Beck took it, and it's a radical vision from a police chief, which is that I'm not talking about traditional enforcement. I'm talking about public health, wraparound safety.
Right. So in the way that you're expressing it, and it's a way that I agree with, community policing by itself, as admirable as that is not enough.
That's right.
That's right.
Okay.
Right.
So, all right. So let's go on. I wanted to go to you, Bill. And Bill Bratton did something that was astounding to me, and I don't have very many heroes as a veteran journalist, but in this respect, Bill Bratton is a hero of mine, because after saving New York City from itself and from the anarchy and crime that was infiltrating the city and dispiriting the city and really destroying it in a sense, Bill came in with some new ideas and stopped that. Then he came to Los Angeles and started the reform of the Los Angeles Police Department. That's an ongoing thing. 20 years later, it was still going on. But the thing that I really admired was then he went back in 2014 to be commissioner of the New York City Police Department again, and stopped the massive race-based stop and frisk policies of New York City that was driving the young men crazy, being stopped all the time. And he did it in the face of a wild, almost savage in its reaction of police union. And for that, I admire him greatly. And I'd ask Bill to talk about how he did that, how he was able to turn that around with the most in the face of the most powerful police union in the country. What levers he pulled and how he managed to implement it. Bill, if you would, please.
Thank you, Joe. Let me put your introductory comments into a context, if you will. Policing, I often compare with health. Policing with medicine. Both of our professions, the purpose is to try to be successful while doing minimum harm to our patients. In the case of a doctor, a patient; in the case of police, the communities that we're serving. And that each city in the United States, each community is different in terms of their health issues, if you will, the issues they're dealing with. In the 90s, quite clearly across America, we had a very ill patient. Every city in America was suffering from crime, disorder, and the failure in the 70s and 80s to get our arms around it. But in attempting to apply medicines during that period of time, we were creating an alienation, if you will, making the patients sicker in many respects, even as we, the police, the physicians, thought we were making them healthier. There's crime in the 90s as we were starting to apply new medicines, community policing, CompStat, problem-oriented policing, that we were having great success. Crime was going down dramatically, disorder was coming under control. But in many of the poor communities, that there was still this belief that even as crime is going down, even as investment is being made into our community, that we still sense that too many of the police are still doing it to us and not with us and for us. But there was also the belief that some of the tactics that police were using to deal with the very serious health crime issues of the 80s, now in the 90s, that even as crime was going down in disorder, and New York's a case in point, that the medicines weren't being diminished, in the sense the enforcement, which is the medicine that we would apply, but rather in many respects were increasing. And that was the case in New York. In New York in the 21st century, my successors as police commissioners, my belief was it was going to be a bell curve, that we were going to have to apply a lot of medicine, a lot of crime strategies to deal with the horrific illness of my patient. But the patient was going to get better. And as the patient got better, we would have a peace dividend. The peace dividend being, I could use more of my police to engage in neighborhood policing, building relationships and trust. I left in '96 after my battling with Rudy Giuliani, and my successors continued to get crime down. And indeed, crime went down in New York for 25 straight years, even after I left until the last 2 years. But what was not improving was relationships with the community in many respects, particularly Black and Brown. And part of that was the strategy, particularly of my immediate predecessor, Ray Kelly, in dealing with the shortage of police he was experiencing. The police force in New York was cut by almost 7,000 officers in the early 21st century due to budget cuts, et cetera. Kelly, in response to that cut, which was not widely understood by the public, interestingly enough, put in place an initiative called Operation Impact, where he took the newest kids out of the academy, and New York graduated several thousand cops a couple of times a year, and put them into the 25 highest crime precincts in the city. Sounds good, put cops on the dots, but the least inexperienced kids were going into the most troubled neighborhoods. And more problematic, they were very poorly supervised. That they had one sergeant trying to basically keep track of 12 new recruits in very troubled neighborhoods. And over the years, a measurement was inserted to ensure that these kids were in fact doing something while they're on the post. And this gets to the point that you raised at the beginning of your comment, Joe. The strategy that they used was to start counting the number of stop, question, and frisk, with the idea that frisks occurred in less frequent occurrences than just a stop and question. And over a period of time, those numbers kept going up. And that's a mistake, because stop, question, frisk is based on reasonable suspicion that an officer sees something that he suspects is a crime, is about to become a crime, or has been a crime, but he is able to articulate his reasonable suspicion. So to try and measure something like that versus a probable cause issue is very problematic. And what it did, it instigated a bean counting in the NYPD, in which stop, question, frisk became the driving force. And it was being implemented by the least experienced, least supervised kids in the department. To the extent that by 2010, there were over 700,000 documented at a time when many things were not being documented appropriately, of these stops. And the community was saying, crime's down dramatically. You're saying it's how wonderful it is, but we're not feeling the benefit. It's like a doctor applying radiation and chemo to get control of your cancer. And the cancer comes under control, but he's keeping giving you radiation and chemo. You still feel sick all the time. And The government was not recognizing that, and they had to be forced into finally starting to pull back. And so by the time I came in 2014 under Mayor de Blasio, who won his mayoral election on the issue of controlling stop, question, and frisk, not ending it, it's an essential tool in American policing, but reducing it dramatically to an appropriate level for a now much safer city. New York right now, 2020, I think the last figures, does about 10 to 12,000 documented stop, question, and sometimes frisk versus 700,000. It was always going down dramatically when I took over, but we implemented one that we stopped counting it in CompStat. It stopped becoming something that precinct commanders felt that their success was going to be evaluated on the number of stops they were doing. And I believe strongly that as the physician, the new physician back at the NYPD, that I needed less medicine like stop, question, frisk for my patient who had effectively been going through a long healing process. Crime by the time I got back to New York in 2014 was down almost 80, 90% from the 1990 levels when I had a very sick patient. So stop, question, and frisk, it's not necessarily something that I stopped or reduced dramatically because it was in that process, but effectively took it out of the measurement of a precinct or an individual officer's success or performance evaluation. And it's like everything we do. It's like a doctor, you need appropriate medicine for your patient at appropriate times. Sometimes you have to, sometimes you don't.
Yeah, Bill, one of the things is that that you didn't mention is that it was a belief among even progressive chiefs that you had to have stop and frisk. If you didn't have stop and frisk, people were going to go wild in poor black and brown neighborhoods, especially the young men. But in fact, crime continued to go down in New York City after the dramatic reduction in stop and frisk. Is that right?
That's correct, because we were also using other medicines, if you will, other tactics, including CompStat had evolved into basically precision policing, where we understood that instead of stopping 100,000 young black men, that 99% of whom were not engaged in any particular problematic action, that we needed to focus on, as Connie has highlighted, those gang members who are the most prolific in creating the crime. And so we were able to develop systems where we could, with more precision, focus on the few who were committing the many crimes that were still being documented. So it's just a different way of leadership, measurement, evaluation, as well as other strategies. Even as a doctor is dealing with your cancer, there's many other things he's working on with your physical therapy, emotional help, psychological help. That's what we did in the NYPD. We developed a neighborhood policing program modeled after the senior lead officer program that had been so effective in LA. We had officers who now were not just focusing on crime, but were in the community focusing on all the issues of concern to a community. That we were trying to put an individual face on the police department rather than the anonymity that had been basically the characteristic of policing in New York for so many decades.
I think, Bill, that you might have skipped over an important part of the story, which was the tremendous battle that went on between Mayor de Blasio, with you at his side, and the police union, which was tremendously dramatic and also really alarming, because it looked like they were the union was going to be an open revolt. How did you deal with that?
I was very fortunate that in New York, I had, by and large, pretty good relationships with the unions and union leaders from my previous time, 20 years before, when New York PD for the first time were being celebrated for basically being the heroes that turned around crime. Then they subsequently had the benefit of the horrific incident of 9/11, but police and fire being seen as so critical at that time. So I started with relationships that many of the police leaders in 2014, union leaders, were the same ones I had been dealing with, not only when I was commissioner, but in the succeeding number of years. I pretty much stayed in touch with them. So I had a personal relationship that and some degree of trust in my leadership going back to the 1990s and subsequent success, I would like to think that we had at the LAPD. So I came in with some pretty good credentials, but what was very problematic was what you pointed out. The mayor was intensely, the newly elected mayor was intensely disliked by the union leadership and by a lot of the rank and file. And throughout my 3 years as police commissioner and my successors these last 4 years, additional 7 years, the unions have been battling with the mayor. But fortunately, the police leadership has been able to try and, if you will, minimize some of that conflict. But it is difficult. It is damn difficult when you have a union that's hostile to your mayor. It's even more difficult when you have a union that's hostile to the police leadership. I was fortunate, with the exception of one of my unions, the Sergeants Union, I was able to maintain throughout my time, and my successes by and large, fairly good relationships with the union that was able to offset the terrible relations with the mayor. The irony of Mayor de Blasio, he has probably done more as mayor for the NYPD than any of his predecessors in terms of equipment, training, all the things that cops want to improve their safety and their skill sets. But that was basically because of the dislike for him. None of that had the usual morale building effect that you might get out of some of that.
Okay, so you had these relationships. Supposing you hadn't had those relationships, what are this? I'm asking this question so the reporters can understand what their mayors or their police chiefs might face in such a situation. What are some of the levers of power that you could have pulled to get them to comply?
Well, there were some that I had to pull. One was the leadership team I surrounded myself with, which were very skilled people, very smart people, many of whom also had good relationships, not only with the union, but also with the communities. The idea of what you're talking about is trying to build a collaborative structure. It's something I think that in LA I was able to do, that Connie can speak to certainly, because she always used to joke that when she first met me, she basically was bragging that she had sued every police chief before me and to get ready because she was probably going to sue me going forward. But ironically that we were able to recruit her into the tent instead of always being outside the tent. So lessons learned in LA in the sense of being able to reach out to people who had been at odds with the police for many years, yourself included, as one of the most prolific and thoughtful writers about the history of the LAPD. Early on, that one of the first books I read coming into in the LAPD was To Protect and Serve. That your book, that was so insightful. It gave me so many insights. So I'm all about the idea of building collaborations. And so in New York, building on a lot of learning experiences in LA, and some of the failure to get appropriate collaboration during my time with Giuliani, I think I came in a much more seasoned veteran about how to pull those levers you're talking about, or levers. There was an article done in the Harvard Business Review called Tipping Point Leadership, about using the levers like Archimedes to move the world. Well, in some respects, police chiefs sometimes trying to move police unions and police departments, you feel like you're trying to move the world with a nightstick as your lever. And it worked in many respects, except the determination and the highlight as we begin this conversation, my comments about criminal justice reform in New York. The collaboration that could have worked so successfully between a now newly progressive legislature, a very progressive governor who had been a little more conservative, and policing in New York, there was no collaboration. It was just done by the legislature, and in many respects done to district attorneys, done to the police, done to the judges, and effectively, ultimately, done to the community, who basically lost ultimately.
Well, let me go to Connie on that. What we saw, Connie, after the demonstrations of last summer was a call not just to defund the police, but essentially to totally reform the police and defund the police, and every effort, not just in New York, but in Minnesota and many other places, turned out to be disasters and nothing changed. There was a big article, I remember, in the New York Times where they said nothing had changed anywhere to any significant extent. What do you attribute that to, Connie?
Well, let me frame it a little bit differently, Joe.
Sure.
The protest accomplished something extraordinary. They ignited an international movement to make Black Lives Matter, and it reached white America. Most of the protesters marching in the streets across this country, up to 20 million, most of them were white Americans. That has never happened in any civil rights era in the history of this country. So they also made police reform an indispensable national issue. It is now a priority of the President of the United States. So the protest accomplished something truly extraordinary, and they get nothing but a standing ovation from me. There is a broad range. There is a broad range of goals and desires. I think that everybody, 100% of everybody, and everybody in this conference, and all the chiefs and sheriffs that I heard this morning, everybody agrees that the George Floyd, that kind of savage brutality, and some of the videos that we've seen of unarmed, unthreatening African Americans who are complying with police command and control commands, being shot nonetheless. That's the outrage around that. I think everybody agrees that cannot be. There's no justification for that. There's no parsing.
So what went wrong?
But in that range, Joe, there are people who want to reform traditional enforcement and make it legitimate, make it trustworthy, make it function for the poor communities that it's being used in. That's what that is what I think Bill is talking about is constitutional, proportionate, justice oriented. Not mass stop and frisk, not mass incarceration, but traditional enforcement that actually provides what the community wants. Then you've got other folks who are saying in hot zones, in the communities that the larger society has left at the bottom of the well, where nothing in government works, no institution, the contract with government does not exist. There's no health care, there's no job infrastructure, the schools don't work, nothing works. You can buy a gun better than you can buy healthy vegetables. These communities are the spiral of despair communities that the McCone Commission talked about in 1965. And in those communities, I think where I differ with Bill is to go from the medicine analogy, I go to the public health analogy. In those communities, the dynamics of violence and trauma and lack of opportunity, the communities that have been defunded for 60 years, probably longer than that, our ghettos, our barrios, our poor rural white areas. We have left these communities in a spiral of despair, which is what the McCone Commission called these communities. And the McCone Commission said, you can't stop the race riots and the rebellions and the uprisings until you do two things. You take your police from this hostile, occupation-style, predatory system of mass incarceration and constant stopping, openly racist treatment that most Black communities have experienced at the hands of law enforcement. You have to transform that into community service and protect and serve that community. Community policing. And you have to end the spiral of despair. So you have to fix your cops, and you have to stop the entrenched poverty and deprivation. We haven't done either. 55 years later, we haven't done either. So when I took a look at some of these hotspots, Joe, and I said, you know what? Take South Bureau in LA, where you had gang control of public housing projects, pools, libraries, all public spaces, parks. The gangs ran the parks. They ran the housing projects. It's an astounding situation. I'm doing my lawsuits. They didn't fix that. Cops keep arresting the same people over and over and over again. The problems grew. We spent $34 billion on a war on gangs. At the end of 35 years, we had 6 times as many gangs and 80,000 gang members, 5% of whom did a lot of violence.
Again, for our listeners, we're talking about Los Angeles here.
Yes, Los Angeles.
We're no longer talking about New York. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, in Los Angeles. So if you take the Watts community where South Bureau is, there were 7,000 unsolved murders in the early 90s. If you have 7,000 unsolved murders, law isn't working, order isn't working, justice isn't working. And so you'd have to move to a public health wraparound safety. You can't just do whack-a-mole arrests. You can't just do stop and frisk. Traditional enforcement was not working. And it was not only that, it was endangering both the cops and the community. So we had to come up with a different system, and that's what we built on when Bill came in and established civilian control, got the standards established for accountability and internal affairs discipline. Bill fixed those systems with that consent decree. We got in the boat, all of us did in that video, to help him accomplish that.
Okay, so
Once it was
let me-
stabilized,
I'm sorry.
we could go to the public health model, which takes the entire community and looks at all of the conditions in that community. It repositions the community, repositions the police to do wraparound safety. It's not about arrests. It's not about suppression. It's about, as Charlie said, making the community healthy enough to be safe.
Okay, let me just put this in a little bit more context. Connie Rice is a very successful civil rights lawyer who was suing the Los Angeles Police Department, getting no results, getting no change. And one way or another, she got together with Bill Bratton, and they decided to work together. Then when Chief Bratton left, Charlie Beck, another great reformer, came in as chief and started working with Connie on a project called the Community Safety Partnerships Program, which is what Connie is going to talk about now.
Yes, and so you have traditional enforcement, which is about making sure that you extract violent people. It's one person at a time, one arrest at a time. You do have strategies for CONSTANCE and hot zones, but it's about enforcement. Enforcement is not safety. And in a safety strategy, you're talking about the health of the community, the conditions of the community that are criminogenic. You're talking about making the community a partner with the officers who are charged with making that community healthier and with generating trust. Enough trust and legitimacy to work with other agencies of government, community members, other institutions, philanthropy, and county and city agencies together. So it's a all hands on deck, whole of government strategy that completely repositions police out of enforcement and control and command and control blue line enforcement, takes it out of that frame and puts it into a whole of community and government safety and problem solving strategy. You empower both the community members to do, and even the policing part of it's a public health wraparound system that goes after the violence, the trauma, and the criminogenic conditions in a neighborhood that is beyond traditional enforcement. The traditional tactical strategies for an epidemic level crisis don't work. When you have an epidemic level of crime and violence, you can't do traditional tactics. You can't do traditional civil rights lawsuits. It doesn't touch it because it's too big. When you have an epidemic, you don't take a fly swatter, a malaria epidemic, you don't take a fly swatter and try and hit individual mosquitoes. You have to drain the swamp. You have to teach the population to behave differently with nets and spray. You have to end the reproductive cycle of the mosquitoes. You have to take a whole of community, drain the swamp system. That's what CSP is. It's a whole of community, whole of government, cross-institutional, cross-agency. The Housing Authority puts in $2 million. The city created the Gang Reduction and Youth Development Department, which puts in $30 million. Then you have the policing component. You have public health, mental health. You have the Violence Reduction Office of the county. You have all of these institutions, plus you have philanthropy and the universities who are collecting data and evaluating the results. The results are, do the populations feel safer? Has violence gone down? Has trauma gone down? Can kids walk to school safely? Are the public spaces no longer gang dominated? Can the kids go to the pool without the gangs charging taxes? All of that whole of community safety and trust is what that is. It's a public health model compared to what Bill is talking about with traditional enforcement, which can be analogized to medicine. When you have an epidemic level of trauma and violence and crime, it's not enough to do traditional enforcement. And that's what the Community Safety Partnership is about. It's a whole of community wraparound system. And you're non-traditional. You have former gang members professionalized to stop retaliation shootings in the wake of a homicide, gang homicides, for example. They protect the fire trucks, the ambulances, and the hospitals. These are former gang members. They're paid by the city of Los Angeles. There's no other city that has put those kinds of systemic resources into this kind of wraparound strategy. You have great programs around the country that are dealing with mental health. They roll out mental health counselors rather than having cops respond. Bill Bratton, you did that with the smart cars way before it became an item in the protesters' agendas. And the problem wasn't the police. The problem was that county workers didn't want to have to respond at 2 a.m. So we have a lot of work to do with shoring up the other organs and institutions of government to actually get in the boat and row. The bottom line is that you're not going to see a difference in policing with what we're doing. You can have all of the legislation, you can have all the lawsuits. Policing doesn't change except from the inside, not the mindset. You have to change the mission, the mindset, and the metrics and the incentives. And that's what the CSP program does.
Okay, thank you, Connie. Christopher, can I ask you to just put the camera on Connie for a minute? Okay, maybe tonight. Okay, what about the portability of this program? Can it be duplicated in other cities?
If you can get the leadership, it's a radical. How
did you get the leadership?
Well, we got the leadership because when Bill came to LA, he reset the framework for LAPD's power in Los Angeles. And he forced a very recalcitrant institution that you've written the history and To Protect and Serve. You wrote the 100-Year War. It was a 100-year war to get that police department to understand that it is under civilian control. Bill Bratton demonstrated that. He had Judge Feast together under the consent decree that came out of the gangster cop scandal, the Rampart crash gangster cop scandal. So you had a court control, which was absolutely necessary.
Also had a very active police commission.
You had the right police commission.
John Mack, former head of the Urban League.
You had Jerry CHALEFF, who was a secret weapon. Without Jerry CHALEFF, I don't think you would have known what to do without Jerry.
That's why I had him in the office next to mine.
Exactly. And putting the constitutional policing office, that was like injecting a COVID virus into LAPD. Bill put a former defense attorney, Jerry CHALEFF, who was a former police commissioner and president of police commission. So he knew policing, he knew what the problems were culturally as well as strategically in enforcement. He knew the whole Megillah. And the two of them, he was like a deputy civilian chief. He was a civilian deputy chief. And with them, and then they pulled people like me in. And so you had all of this was an unlikely alliance of former combatants.
Team of rivals.
Yeah, rivals. And we basically said, you know what, we're stuck on stupid. Everything that we're all doing, all of our work is good. My cases are good. I win my cases. But my clients were still dying in hellholes. And I said, I've got to change what I do. I've got to attack the violence and the conditions, and I've got to change the way police see what they do in these communities. A lot of cops are like, look, you're sending me into a war zone. I want to come out alive. I'm going to take down everybody I have to. That is exactly what a lot of cops told me. And
so
what I say, well, wait a minute, Joe. I think that what you have to do, you have to make it safe enough.
Go ahead.
You have to make it safe enough for the cops to change and for the community to change together.
Mm-hmm. So do police reformers need to work with cops? Do they need to work with cops?
You can't do it without the police. What Connie was just referring to, the LAPD was and still is probably one of the most highly trained organizations in America on tactics, officer safety. Officer safety was always paramount, but in their approach to the public, it was always that Joe Friday type of approach, that officer safety almost created a barrier between them and the public, so that the public just saw this guy with the old days, the mirrored sunglasses and the long-handled flashlight, just the fax man. And what she's effectively talking about was humanizing the cops, that they could police safely, but they could police it in a different way. And the expression earlier about you kind of rest your way out of the problem. One of the poster boys for an LAPD cop was a Chief Green, who came up through all the SWAT units, et cetera, handsome as could be. But my favorite expression from him at a community meeting was, the idea to take off of, you kind of rush your way out of the problem. His expression was, the future is not in handcuffs. He got it. And when some of the role models for the old LAPD model of officer safety first and foremost got it, they could start pushing it down into the rank and file. But that's a long, long process, but it can be done. And the model, as Connie has pointed out, was LA. I tried to implement so much of what I learned in LA back in New York. Some of it we have brought in, much improved force investigation divisions to build up trust, much improved training. What I literally tried to do was blend the two departments together, the best of both departments, and learn from the worst practices that they had both been engaged in.
Connie, so you've made clear that there can't be police cultural reform without community, without changing the lives of the people, poor Black and brown people in the communities. Can there be a real change in police culture, and in the whole aspect of police reform without the police being willingly involved?
It's a matter of having the mavericks inside of policing, the visionaries inside of policing. At the executive level, policing has changed. But what I tell the community is that the DNA has not changed. The rank and file, the old guard sergeants in the back of the squad room still putting their thumbs down over any kind of community engagement or any kind of reimagining of just seeing the humanity in a struggling, despairing community and what their role in it is. What we've produced with mass incarceration, and this is not just the police, this is the whole of society. We've produced through mass incarceration, Joe, a Black man coming out of his housing project in Watts, Los Angeles, in Nickerson Gardens, faces a 45% chance of going to jail on any given day that he steps out of his unit. That is what we have created, and that's what Michelle Alexander is talking about in the machinery of the new Jim Crow. You cannot look at that as a good result. I don't care if you're a cop or a civil rights lawyer. We're talking about re-engineering both policing and the community. It takes as much change from both sides to be able to work together on something new. And that's what the community safety partnership does. It empowers the community to sit at the table. The cops are not there as regular enforcers. They are there as part of a wraparound safety strategy. And that is the radical vision. That's the real reimagining. And it's been done and documented in LA, and it wouldn't have started had Bill Bratton not come to LA first. It takes the visionaries inside policing. They have to be powerful enough to do it. And a lot of the progressive chiefs are not powerful enough to actually force through that kind of change. You have to change the incentives, and that takes a lot. I think what journalists miss is how complex this situation is, and what comprehensive change and culture change in institutions that are military or engineering or policing, it takes a long time. And I don't think the community has the patience to wait. And that's the conundrum right now. And right now, police are in a war footing. They're not accepting that there's anything wrong. There's tremendous resistance against Black Lives Matter, an overreaction to a peaceful protest movement, and a complete underreaction to a MAGA insurrection. Crickets on the latter, a lot of chatter in police. We've got some very, very fundamental work to get back to where we were when Bill Bratton was in LA, I'm sad to say. We're not on a good footing right now for reform.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Bill Bratton became chief of the LAPD in 2002, started the reform process, had an excellent successor in Charlie Beck, who really moved the ball forward in terms of reform. But yet, just the day before yesterday, there was a highly critical report about the LAPD and the way that they responded to the peaceful protests of last summer. Bill, what does that tell you, if anything?
Well, I'm also very friendly with the current chief, Mike Moore, who was basically bought into everything we were doing. And one of the reasons he's chief today was like Charlie Beck. He grew up in the old LAPD, but recognized there needed to be a new one. So without having had access to the report you're referencing, it just came out yesterday, that I'd be interested to read that. But I'm also very conscious of what Mike Moore is struggling with my successor, Dermot Shea in New York is struggling with, is all of these pressures to change at a time when, in effect, in LA, the police department's being starved to death for resources, but all the other things that people want in the sense of reform of the police, the idea of better treatment of the homeless, better treatment of emotionally ill, major issues certainly in LA, if not around the country, it's going to take money. And you cannot basically get this collaboration that you need if all of the entities involved, one, are not working together, two, the demand that they do work together, but three, the funding is not there. One thing to take the police away from enforcing issues dealing with the homeless or the mentally ill, but at 2 o'clock in the morning, if you don't fund having all those resources, civilian resources out there, who are you going to call? I'm going to call the police once again, who don't have, once again, the training resources. No, we're in an inflection point that, and I'm hoping that there's a full understanding, and this is what I tried to write about in my book, The Profession, the idea of 50 years ago, I joined policing, and now in 2021, in some respects, we're almost back to where we started. Connie's comment that instead of going forward, in some respects, we're slipping back again. And that's what we have to try to correct, that we don't slip, that we take advantage of this opportunity to slip the other way, go forward.
Connie, what's your reaction to
I agree with that assessment, but I also want to say we could have easily lost the Community Safety Partnership, and a year into his term, Chief Moore this past summer created the only bureau in a major police department that is dedicated to this guardian public health safety strategy for cops to do, with a civilian deputy chief and a sworn deputy chief in the model of the partnership with the community. So it takes a lot of, it takes reallocating current resources, the salary lines. You have to get your workers and the county government agencies to work differently, and they don't really want to. So we've got a lot of work to do in the other organs of government, as well as aggressive mindset change, mission change, and metrics and incentive change in traditional enforcement. I think the thing that has changed over the last 30 years, which is really all we've been doing, police reform didn't really happen until 30 years ago. And what we've been doing is at the executive level, things have changed tremendously. But that doesn't mean anything to Rodney King and George Floyd. It hasn't changed the on-the-ground interactions in our hot zones. The journalists need to distinguish which communities we're talking about. Most communities like mine, they receive concierge safety. In poor communities that have been excluded, we have mass incarceration, criminalization of homelessness and poverty, and we send the cops in there to suppress it and contain it. Until that paradigm changes, we are not going to see fundamental or radical change.
Bill, last word from you.
My last word would be one of optimism at a time when there's certainly a lot of reason to be pessimistic. And the reason I remain optimistic is that I came into the business in 1970. Over the last 50 years, I've seen phenomenal change, some of what Connie's alluded to in terms of the thinking of leadership, the leadership of American policing. It has truly become a profession versus it was none of those things. And I write about that in the book. But the optimism is tempered with the idea also of the new tensions that are becoming very evident day to day. The whole idea of so much of what we're dealing with is around the issue of race, all these militias and QAnon, et cetera, the way the Republicans are going. It's all about race. Let's not kid ourselves. It's all about the continuation of 400 years, basically, of this country being divided around the issue of race. And the reason I'm optimistic, I think the entity that has been at the center of that for so long, policing, both good and bad, that at the leadership level there's an appreciation that to fix it is going to require fixing American policing. And that is what has changed in the last 30 years, the idea that we are central to what caused the problem, but we're going to have to be central to fixing the problem. And I think it can be fixed, not easily, with a lot of hard work, but it can be fixed.
All right, well, I think we have some time. Connie, did you want to add something? Of course, I think we have time for a few questions here. Let's take one from Melanie Everly. She says that TCRFL, okay. So, what is the solution to achieving reform and better relations between police agencies and communities in conjunction in places where police unions that may be resistant to change? Well, I think we've gone over that. In case there's anything you want to, there seems to be widespread dynamic in larger police agencies. Is there something that can be done on a national scope to move things forward? One of the things that there was before your panel now, there was a gentleman who was the head of the Sheriff's National Association, and I wanted to ask him if he was willing to go out and preach the gospel that we've been talking about throughout our conversation. Do police chiefs and county sheriffs need to get out and preach that gospel and become more, not political, because we're talking about science-based stuff here, and we're talking about social justice as well. Do they need to go out and preach that gospel and so that the kind of resources that Connie's talking about to help revive these impacted communities can happen?
Well, I can speak more for the police rather than the sheriff's department, because many of the sheriffs are politically elected into their offices, and their viewpoints are reflective of the communities they're policing. So in many of these red states, the sheriffs, the leadership, and then again, most police chiefs are appointed by political leadership, that you're going to see chiefs reflective of the communities and the political leadership of those communities. But the good news is that in the organizations like Major City Chiefs, to a lesser extent ISCP, and even the National Sheriff's Organization, over the last 20, 30 years, there's been more of a willingness to step up and speak out. Art Acevedo at Major City Chiefs, that's extraordinarily outspoken, progressive chief down in Houston. And we also have organizations like the Police Executive Research Forum that does phenomenal work and study, and so that there is a foundation to build upon. But this is a long, tortuous process. It's not going to be easy, particularly at this point in time in our history, where just watching what's going on in Congress these last couple of days is indicative of where we are in America at this juncture. I do not envy my former contemporaries in American policing at this time. I think it was a lot easier for me back in the 90s and as recently as 2014. 2021 America, it is going to be incredibly difficult for American police chiefs and sheriffs. And again, to create change, you must become the change. And the good news is many of them have become the change. And so hopefully over time they can reach the point that Connie's talking about, where they push that change very far down into their organizations.
I'm afraid that talk at this point, Joe, well, I think it's necessary. I think inside these police departments, you have to change what cops get promoted for. That's when you start to see the behavior change. You can tell them to commune. As one cop told me, "Lady, you're nuts. I'm not going to commune with people who hate me. And if I'm bleeding out in Grape Street Alley, no one's going to call 911." And that's that trust barrier. So until you can position police and community to pursue something different, a different mission, until you can change the incentives for what cops get promoted for, until you change what the money rewards, and you start to see the accountability infrastructure, you're not going to see the kind of change that the community is saying and the protesters are saying is necessary. So yeah, talk and preaching is important, but if your force isn't following you and they think that you're just kowtowing to a bunch of hostile outsiders, you're not going to get any kind of response that the community is going to see on the ground. So, I mean, you've got to change the conditions inside your organization, not just policing, but probation and corrections. We're talking about all of the organs of criminal justice apparatus, the whole machine. You've got to change the mission, the metrics, the mindset, and what you reward people for, and what you punish them for. both the informal and the formal culture. The formal culture is coming along. The informal culture that actually controls how cops behave, it's stuck, and it's regressing because police are feeling under attack. And the community now doesn't have the patience. They're like, done. We've had 400 years. How much longer do you need? If we can't get in there and create a space where we can create something new that both can see progress in, we're just headed in a very bad direction. But I am optimistic because we've seen the CSP Bureau stood up in LAPD by Chief Moore. We've seen a lot of progressive chiefs. There wasn't a panel, Sheriff Mahoney, who was it, Chief Garcia and Chief Brackney, they're finishing my sentences. That doesn't mean much in the community, but that's why there's hope, as you've had change at the leadership top of the leadership. Getting the cultural change in the rank and file, however, is going to take a whole lot more.
Mike Adaney has a question. It has to do with training of police. He represents a warrior cop class that somebody is teaching. One of the things the LAPD has done is really changed the training of the officers. But yet, when push came to shove during the demonstrations, there were a lot of officers that lost control. I'm not saying that I wouldn't have, but it's something that. But I'm not a professional cop. So my question actually is, how long does it take to change to change the culture of a police department through training? How long? I mean, it seems to me it's like a generation. Is that right, Bill?
Joe, you've just touched on the fly in the ointment that right now the LAPD, for example, which is probably one of the best trained police departments in the country in terms of its academy, its in-service training, it takes money. That when you take a cop out of the station and put him into academy for in-service training, it takes money. And every police department in America suffers in the category of, one, we don't train our recruits long enough initially. 6 months is not enough time to train a recruit. The LAPD has the 6 months, but then the training program with the training officers for a period of time after that. I had to institute that in New York finally, because they weren't doing it. But in my 50 years in policing, I only had 3 years where I had incredible amounts of money to put my cops into training, to train them on implicit bias, to train them on narcotic recognition, that you don't treat every narcotics user exactly the same because they all have different symptoms you're dealing with, use of force training. And where we're going to suffer going forward with the defunding of the police, I have to laugh about that. You don't need to defund the police, you need to fund the police so they can do much more training. And until we get the abilities to train, to constantly train, to refresh, Connie's point that if I can reinforce with the training issue, the one thing that we do every year is we put the cops back through the training at the range on their firearms, the most deadly tool that they have, the firearm. Everybody gets trained at least once, sometimes twice, LAPD 6-7 times a year, but we don't get them back for in-service training and all the changing things that they're facing in society. Can you imagine going to a doctor who 20 years ago got out of medical school, began his practice, and then never went back for any type of retraining, or he wasn't kept current with all the changes in his profession? That's what we do with police. And now the whole issue with this defund movement, the idea of taking funds away from the police, we're effectively doing it at the absolute worst time when we should be funding more training, because there's so many new issues they have to deal with, dealing with the emotionally disturbed, the idea of implicit bias training. That is the fly in the ointment as it relates to the police component of this.
Connie, let me give you the last word on it.
Yeah, I always ask the question, Joe, I always ask the question, training for what? And got to remember, a lot of the formal training, you look at it and there's nothing wrong with the formal training for an enforcement paradigm, for the traditional enforcement policing. The problem is what you saw in the George Floyd video. Derek Chauvin was a training officer. He had people who were 2 weeks out of the academy and he was training them as he murdered George Floyd. The training officers basically tell the recent grads, Forget what you learn. I'm going to keep you alive. And here's how we do it. That hasn't changed. Not in LAPD, not in NYPD, nowhere else. That is still a dynamic and a strain of policing DNA, number one. Number two, I personally am not interested in better trained within this current paradigm that goes way beyond policing. It's the criminalization of poor communities, the criminalization of mental illness, the war on drugs, the entire Megillah has got to be absolutely reconstructed and just something new.
Well, Connie, we're on the same wavelength there. The training I'm talking about, you're right, we do a great job in the sense of the use of the firearm, et cetera. But the whole paradigm of policing has changed in the sense of dealing with the emotionally disturbed, dealing with the drug addict, dealing with all the new stresses particularly on those poor minority communities, because so many other elements are failing them, that we have no place to put the emotionally disturbed. We are not treating drug addicts adequately. We're not dealing with all the stresses of domestic violence and those tensions. And that's the training I'm talking about, that we need a better education. You can't train a cop in 6 months.
That's right. I agree with that, Bill. And I think that on the funding issue, when I talk about refunding the community, I'm not talking about the couch change that people are talking about in police budgets. You have to look at all of the county and agency budgets. Do I think that we put too much into enforcement? I think society does. Just like we put too much into our military industrial complex. At the loss, these communities have been left at the bottom of the well with no institutions that work. I mean, look at how the pandemic stripped the bark off the tree, and you can see, look at these communities. They've got nothing to protect themselves. And what few jobs they had that they traveled 3 and 4 hours on a bus to get to, they're gone. So when I talk about funding, we're not talking about the couch change in police budgets. You could take the $6 billion of NYPD and the $3 billion in LAPD. That would be a down payment for South LA. If you're talking about the job infrastructure, the medical, the public health infrastructure, you're talking about grocery stores, you're talking about all of the amenities and services and functions of government that are not in these communities. That is a massive investment that we have never done. The spiral of despair side of this equation has never been done. And so I think that the conversation has to be about, are we serious about bringing these communities into the American table, to the American table of prosperity? And we are not. That is not a policing issue. Police aggravate it because we send them in there to maintain that infrastructure. But I think it's a much bigger conversation about what does it take to fund the viability and the health of these communities, and what policing matches that.
Steve, do we have time for one more question?
I wanted, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask a very quick question that goes back to our central theme in the time we have left. It's been 5 years since we've had the President's Task Force Commission report on 21st century policing. And, depending on where you sit, people will say nothing much has been done since then. Other people say that a lot has been accomplished. But this alludes to something that Bill said towards the beginning of the session about the role of the federal government. I mean, the feds sort of set the climate, and I think you sort of were indicating that what's important is setting that correct climate. And the climate before under the present administration is very different from what we now see. We saw just a year ago. I wonder if you guys could just elaborate on that, about what role, if any, the feds have in improving the nature of American policing.
The role of the federal government and the collaboration we're talking about is essential. One, for purposes of national standards that are necessary. Two, the funding that is oftentimes necessary. The enforcement that was so weakened during the last 4 years. I was the beneficiary, and I think Los Angeles, the LAPD, of the federal consent decree. I have a lot of problems with a lot of consent decrees. The one up in Oakland is a disaster. But when properly designed and implemented, that they work in the sense of leveraging the culture change and leveraging the changes necessary. So the feds play a very critical role. And I would argue going forward for what we've been discussing this last hour, actually for what you've been discussing the last several days at John Jay, they're going to be an essential partner in all of this. But they can't be, if you will, the most significant player, because all of these issues really come down to the individual communities we're talking about. So the partnerships have to be at the local, state, and federal level. And no one entity, federal or state, should be the final controlling entity, as each community has different needs, has different priorities, if you will. And that is always the dilemma, trying to, that was the whole beauty of the essence of community policing, the concept of partnership to identify what were the problems that were going to be prioritized, and the focus on dealing with those problems to such an extent we cure them and then prevent them from coming back. So federal government can be a critical player, but it's not the only player.
And I would add, Steve, that the federal government needs to set the national standards for the 18,000 policing forces across the country. It also needs to establish the data collection. The FBI can't tell you how many people are killed by police every year. That's absurd. That's like United Airlines not reporting plane crashes. So a data collection so that you can actually evaluate what's effective, what's going down, what's going up. Data collection. And then these task forces that are used, cloud accountability. You have all of these different agencies on a task force. Well, local law enforcement can be behaving under the aegis of the task force, but you can't get at it. I'm talking as a civil rights lawyer, because you can't pinpoint who took what actions. There needs to be an accountability infrastructure for the task forces. And the fourth thing is that the destruction of trust by ICE. In these poor immigrant communities, it took decades to try to get people to even report crime. And you have the sort of modern day, it's just an awful, awful system that it has devastated the trust. So a number of federal policies, and then the enforcement of the consent decrees. We need a Department of Justice completely restored because it was destroyed under the Trump administration. And we need to get the consent decree checks back into operation. Bill could not have done what he did without that federal consent decree.
Thank you, Kai. Boy, you just opened up a subject for a whole nother panel, maybe a whole other day, but we'll have to leave it there. But I want to thank both of you very much for an extraordinary panel, and Joe for leading it. It's been a great listening to you, and I hope you'll stay with us for the rest of the day. We're going to be really looking at many of the themes that you guys have touched on this morning so well. We'll take another 10-minute break, and then we'll come back with our new panel. Thank you all.
Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Bye, guys.
Connie, Joe, great to see you guys.
Great to see you. Take care.
Bye, Connie.
Bye-bye.